All right, I think we can go ahead and get started, everybody. Um, Looks like we've got a good crowd, about 20 or so people. So thanks all for joining and welcome. Super excited that everybody's here for this session. Really looking forward to hearing all the great insight that Jennifer and Kendra are going to share with us about accessibility across the digital product lifecycle. Just by way of quick introduction, I'm Rob Colenso. I'm a member of the UXPA DC board, along with Asha Singh, who's also here as well. Asha, hey. And Jordan Higgins was not able to be here tonight because he's teaching a class at George Mason, so warping young minds as we speak. But we're very grateful to him for all of his amazing continued support as president of the chapter. Bless his heart. So thanks, everybody. Just again, quick announcements because I want to get the heck off the stage and let Jennifer and Kendra do their thing because they're way more interesting than I am. But a few things of note. We're going to talk a little bit about the UXPA DC mentorship program now in, God, I don't even know what year it's in. Stephanie, 3 years. Wow, 3 years. Okay. I don't know if Stephanie's here or not. Is she here? Is she here, Asha? I can stunt double for her if she's not. Okay, I'm going to try and stunt double for Stephanie when we talk about that part. We'll talk about other ways you can get involved with all the fun that is UXPA DC. We'll talk a little bit about our pals at Media Barn, which have been longtime staunch and stalwart supporters of all things UXPA. And then we'll hear from Jennifer and Kendra, and then we'll do some Q&A at the end. So first up, the UXPA DC mentorship program now in its, thank you, Asha, third year. Deadline is coming up very, very soon for registering to request to become either a mentor or a mentee. We would love to always have more of both. There's always really strong interest, particularly among people seeking to be mentees. And in order to ensure the broadest degree of possible diversity in ensuring good matches with possible mentors, we're definitely for sure interested in getting folks into the mentor pool side of things as well. I can tell you firsthand from having mentored myself the last couple of years, it was an amazing experience. And I think I learned as much as a mentor as hopefully my mentees did. And at least they didn't run screaming from the building. So I've got that going for me. The deadline to register is February 21st at 11:59 p.m. You can do so by either signing up at, as you see on the screen, uxpadc.org/mentorship-program, or you can send an email to mentorship@uxpadc.org. So, and huge props to Stephanie for continuing to champion that program. Other ways to get involved, as promised. The best way to stay in touch with what's happening up to the minute, live breaking news sort of stuff is on DCUX's Slack channel. Best way to find that is by going to uxpadc.org and clicking through from there. We also would love to get more people involved in volunteering for events. We're always looking for speakers, new speakers, people, particularly people who have not done a lot of public speaking before. We'd love to be a place for you to help hone your public speaking chops. It's a safe space. We promise we won't make much fun of you. No, we won't at all. We want to make this a really safe space for everybody to really practice those skills. And we make a point of recording these sessions so that inevitably when somebody else asks you when you're pitching to be a speaker to them, do you have a recording of yourself having done this before? Why, yes, I do. UXPA DC taped me and it was awesome. So we'd love to have the broadest possible swath of voices from across the DMV sharing their insights with the rest of the community. So by all means, please reach out and let us know if you've got something interesting to talk about. We'd also love to get people involved more broadly in chapter activities, both in terms of event organization as well as sort of thinking about kind of the broader direction and focus of UXPA, particularly in this strange time of loving the time of COVID that we're in right now. We could particularly use help in the area of operations, which is to say organizing events, but also getting the word out about those events to make sure that people know that we're doing all kinds of cool stuff, because we're not Field of Dreams again here. We don't hope that if we build it, they will come. And that's it, I think. So if anybody has questions about any of that I just sort of speed ranted at you all, email Jordan, not me. He's the easiest to get a hold of because his email address is easy to remember, president@uxpadc.org, or hit up Jordan via the UXPADC Slack. And now I want to give a shout out to our friends at Media Barn. Nikki, do you want to jump in and say a little bit about Media Barn? I know that from my perspective, I am hugely grateful for all of the support that Media Barn has provided to UXPADC over many, many years now. And they're definitely as close a family member to UXPADC as anybody in town. So we're very grateful to have their partnership. So Nikki, the stage is yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob. Great introduction, and good evening, everyone. I was just about to say good morning, but it is the evening. I have too much coffee in my system and I'm sort of running on fumes, but that's okay. It is a long week ahead. So good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. Media Barn is a proud sponsor of UXPA DC and of course DC UX. For those of you who are maybe new or new-ish or unfamiliar with Media Barn, I'll give you a little bit of a top line introduction to who we are and what we do. I promise not to bore you with a lot of details or a lot of specifics, just so that we can get to our speakers tonight. I'm so excited to hear what they have to say, what Jennifer and Kendra have to say around the design process. But I do want to just take about a minute or so to sort of give the overall framework of who Media Barn is. So we are local to the Arlington, Virginia area. We're literally steps away from the courthouse metro once metro actually starts running up again, and we're kind of a little bit more normal post-COVID, and we're back to each other and hugging and shaking hands. Hopefully we can see you there in our office and courthouse. But we're basically a user experience consultancy, and we specialize in, of course, the HCD process, the human-centered design process. Vaguely speaking, or just overall speaking, we're sort of split up into three unique divisions, but they're all they all resolve around UX, of course, but providing different unique solutions. The first arm or division of our company is the placement services, which provides UX and design staffing services to our clients both locally and nationally. We provide a number of contract and permanent openings. So if you are on the market for a job, if you're starting your job hunt or your job search, please let me know, contact me directly. I believe we have a couple of clients right now that are looking for UX designers and researchers, content strategists, and a lot more other UX designy type of specific roles. So again, if you're on the job market or just starting your hunt, reach out to me and I'd be happy to connect you to our staff here at Media Barn and connect you all in that way. Our second division is probably what we're most known for here at Media Barn, and that's our research arm, as it were. And of course, just by the sort of title of research arm, we essentially provide end-to-end research services, including things like one-on-one usability testing, focus groups, survey analysis, survey creation, and a whole lot more under what you might consider traditional UX research. We do also have a full lab here in the courthouse Arlington area with two-way mirrors and HD cameras, eye tracking, which is my favorite. I geek out and nerd out on eye tracking. So if you are wanting to have an actual place to go and have a dedicated space to conduct or moderate or facilitate your studies, this is an awesome space. Please come take a tour. We'd be happy to sort of show you our tools and the things that we sort of have here at our disposal. And last but not least, finally, before I get off the stage and bore you too much, is of course our digital agency, and we partner with clients and other sort of clients around the IRS, the EPA, CMS, Centera Health. There's a whole list of clients that we provide end-to-end solutions for in a range of services. Of course, not just research, but strategy, design, prototyping, things of that like. So if you have any need for any of the things that I just mentioned, placement services, you're looking for a job, you want to actually come in person post-COVID when things are a little back to normal, and maybe you want a tour of our facilities for actually facilitating and moderating your research studies in person, or if you would just sort of like to get to know us a little bit more, we'd be happy to speak with you. So that being said, let me pass the invisible mic back over to Rob so that we can kick off tonight's amazing event with Jennifer and Kendra.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nikki. Seriously, Team Media Barn.
You're welcome. Absolutely.
All right. And now for the really good stuff, right? So I will try and hopefully hold a candle to the awesomeness of Jennifer and Kendra. They're longtime UX pros across the board. Jennifer, she's been in the game 25 years, led product teams, been down in the blood and the mud through pretty much every role in the product lifecycle. And I think brings an interesting perspective to this conversation about Ohana for digital service design as she notes, a multiracial older woman in tech with invisible disabilities, right? These are the things that we are really bad at paying attention to as an industry. And when we bring in diverse teams of people from across all different walks of life and put them all in the same room, we suddenly find people like Jennifer who can bring really unique insight and perspective to the conversation. And so we're really glad that she's teamed up with Kendra, who also is a UX pro, 10 years of government digital product experience. She, as she describes it, has led and championed accessibility initiatives for both state and federal programs. So down in the thick of it with a hatchet, trying to clear through the bureaucracy and make things more accessible for all different humans, which is awesome. She's dealt with questions of how to integrate accessibility into content design, development, testing, governance, contracting, and product management in ways that save time and money and provide value for end users. And being able to square that circle with the management that inevitably says, but accessibility is so hard and death by 1,000 cuts. And can that just be a P1? No, it's P0, y'all. We're doing this, right? And so they have learned some hard lessons in their time, and we're super excited that they're going to share them with us. So welcome to both of you. And are you driving, Nikki? Or excuse me, Kendra?
Yes, I am.
You are driving. Okay, then I will make you the presenter.
I am the host now. All right.
Our host, the tiller is yours.
All right.
Power.
And thank you for the kind introduction. You have no idea that the description of cutting through the bureaucracy feels so accurate.
Yeah.
So howdy, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, late afternoon, early evening. So just start out a little bit introducing myself. My name is Kendra Skeen. I am, previously I was the director of product for Digital Services Georgia, and that's the work I'm going to speak the most about tonight because I don't have to get permission from a federal agency to talk about my work, which is a very difficult thing to do. Talking about what I did at Georgia is easy. But in the last couple of years, I've been doing product management at Ad Hoc, currently a principal product manager and product lead for one of our VA contracts. So that is me. And I want to kick over to my friend Jennifer.
Hi there. And I actually worked with Kendra for a while, and her team was one of the best at meeting accessibility and caring about it. She's one of the good PMs, one of the great PMs, not just good. So for me, I am currently a freelance UX lead and accessibility contractor at Level Access. I also recently attained something I've wanted for years, which I'm an invited expert for the WCAG Silver Task Force and leading the heading subgroup. So I decided, instead of complaining about how obtuse WCAG is, to get in there and do something about it. So cross my fingers that I managed to help get something out in the next few years that's easy to understand for everyone. I'm trying.
I'm so excited that you're doing that. It's amazing.
So I years ago watched Lilo and Stitch because I was raising a munchkin, as I call it, a teenager. And so we watched Lilo and Stitch, and I saw this Ohana means family. Lilo and her sister, their parents had passed away or something, and so they were living together. And rather than give Lilo up for adoption, her sister kept her because Ohana means family, and family means no one gets left behind or forgotten. Then this weird creature shows up in their yard, and Lilo was like, oh, because she really wanted a dog. And she didn't know that this was actually a space alien. And her sister wanted to get rid of it. And you can see there's a clip in the movie where the sister's like, I don't think this is a dog. I don't even think it's from Earth or human or something. And Lilo says, but Ohana. And the sister says, you always bring Ohana on me. And so they kept Stitch. And so the whole relationship of this is about exclusion. And we all probably know what it feels like to be excluded. And in our work, do we really want to be excluding people? I was speaking with Gareth Ford Williams of the BBC over the weekend, and he brought up something really great. He said, the next time I have a team that isn't wanting to be fully inclusive, he says, let's make a list. Let's make a list of all of the people that we're willing to exclude. And that's okay. That's okay. If we know that we're going to exclude, for example, people who use IE6 or something like that. But you put the names of who we're willing to exclude on the board. And every time we make a decision, we'll say, so that's now going to exclude screen reader users. Right? Are we going to add that to the list of people we're willing to exclude?
Oh, I love that.
So, and we are all disabled. It's a big statement. Situationally. So sometimes you might be out with your mobile phone and it's a really sunny day and you're trying to look at the Google Maps to figure out where you're going, but there's so much sunlight you can't read because the contrast isn't quite enough. You're situationally impaired, or you're in a loud room and you can't hear anything. Situationally disabled. Temporarily disabled. Say you broke your arm, or, oh my God, I scratched my eye once taking off one of those pullover things with the zipper here, or had a baby, or had trouble sleeping, or we're all currently living through a pandemic and we're all cognitively fatigued. So I bet you we're all temporarily disabled in that respect. So cognitive considerations matter a lot these days. And then some people are permanently disabled. I have a traumatic brain injury. I have PTSD. They're not going anywhere. And I only last year finally decided to accept that I am legitimately disabled enough, whatever that means. One of the things that Gareth also said this weekend is there are no people with disabilities. There are only situations that disable people.
Mm.
So we're going to talk about how we don't make people with disabilities.
I like that framing.
Gareth is full of gold. I'm just like, wow. If you want to read more about inclusive design and different types of disabilities, permanent, temporary, situational, the Microsoft Inclusive Design Toolkit, mad props. It's really full of, as you can see here, there's examples for the senses that are permanent, temporary, and situational. write down the last point I said. I don't remember which one it was, Jimmy. Can you take a note and I'll try to restate it later, or write it into the chat when we do Q&A. Put a pin in it. Oh, the previous slide was we're all situationally, temporarily, or permanently disabled. And then the other piece is there are no disabled people. There are only people who are disabled by systems.
Systems or situations. I think an example I heard recently that I thought was really great was that in the dark, someone with vision impairments is no longer disabled, right? Like now they're fine, and we're the ones that are, disabled because we can't see our way around.
Beautiful. That one's really great. Okay, so we're in DC, and this is probably most people's response to when you have to meet Section 508. So what exactly is Section 508? And what's inclusive design? Let's dig into that. So Section 508 was recently updated, and it now means meet WCAG 2.0 success criteria. WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and those are created by a task force at the W3C. And 2.0 is a set, and they include success criteria for blindness, deafness, and keyboard usage primarily. Then just last year, I think it was, no, a couple of years ago. What year is this? It's 2021, even though it doesn't feel like it. I think we're perpetually stuck in March of 2020, but 2.1 came out in 2018, and it added success criteria for mobile and cognition. So cognition means people like me with a traumatic brain injury or PTSD, or maybe there's folks who are on the spectrum or have ADHD, or people who have anxiety and depression. And so all of those sort of considerations need specific success criteria that 2.1 addresses. And by meeting 2.1, more people can use your output on mobile, and they better understand it because you're using things like plain language and reducing the amount of content and etc. So, and then there is also inclusive design. So that means it's accessible for all, not just people with disabilities. And by focusing on inclusive design, you improve your user experience by making the data itself more accessible, as well as improving things like web performance. The faster your page loads, the better your user experience, and the more users don't, like, I don't know if you've ever dug into your bounce rate metrics, but you could have some if your site doesn't load quickly, your bounce rate's definitely going up. So more users mean your project generally is more successful, and that means happy stakeholders as well as happy users. So then there's also usable, highly usable, usability, overall ease of use. That is the penultimate of meeting all of these levels. And that means that your business and user goals are attained. Woo, woo. So I want to dig into a little bit more of the details of these and why you may or may not know about WCAG 2.0. So WCAG 2.0 was released by the W3C Web Content Accessibility Task Force in 2008. But Section 508 at that time was based on parts of WCAG 1.0. In 2017, 9 years later, Section 508, the Access Board, adopted WCAG 2.0 as the standard. So to meet Section 508 requirements, you need to meet WCAG 2.0. And I feel guilty saying WCAG because I know that that's still like, all that's coming to my mind right now is verboten, German, like some word that is hard to understand. So I feel guilty, but and 2018, the year after Section 50, the Access Board took WCAG 2 as a success criteria for Section 508, the W3C came out with WCAG 2.1, which that's when it added the mobile and cognitive considerations. Now we're working on WCAG 3.0, which is nicknamed Silver. You'll sometimes see it as AG because that's the periodical table of elements for silver. It started work in 2016, and we just released the first public working draft last month. And right now the guidelines are expected late 2023. They were previously expected late next year, but things are definitely taking longer than originally planned. They've got some new grading parameters that they're trying to do, something with bronze and silver and gold, and a maturity model. And to be honest, we've got some work to do. And I want to make sure we're bringing in folks like all of you to make sure that whatever gets put out makes sense. With the current administration's push towards WCAG 2.1, I heard a rumor that the Access Board is considering updating Section 508 to WCAG 2.1 because the White House has been pushing that they want things at 2.1. So I've got all of my things crossed, and I'm really, really hoping, because it breaks my heart to think that we're not meeting the needs of mobile users and those with cognitive impairments with everything we do anyway.
And I think what's helpful just to sort of think about with that framing is it hasn't been set as Section 508 requirements yet, but the WCAG 2.1 standards are still listed there as best practices, as, you know, here's some ways to make your website more inclusive to people. And, you know, same with the specs that are starting for 3.0, that we don't have to wait, you know, like we can start looking at these and figuring out how do we level up, you know, and just improve how many of those people can, you know, access our websites now.
Well, we can do it when we're people like you who are product managers who set the priorities and the requirements. So everyone wants to work for a PM like Kendra, because then you get to do this. But making that case and getting leadership to get on board with that can be really challenging. They basically often just want to do what's the bare minimum, and even doing that sometimes is a battle. And I'm hoping that we give you here some tools to support your discussion with them.
Absolutely, not going to disagree with you there.
So the Access Board tells you how to meet Section 508, and they suggest following this process. First thing is you want to build awareness and support. So you want to train your teams, and you want to make sure that you get leadership on board. So find your champions, find the people who you can convert. Next, you want to practice. They have it in their guidelines as practice universal design, but I would really go a couple steps further. I have a practice inclusive design here, but I have learned something new recently, and I would actually advocate for practice equitable design, which that's a whole other conversation that it's probably a whole other presentation to give. But basically don't exclude anyone and do the best you can to provide equity in experience for folks, whether they have old, slow devices or no devices even, versus the fancy, brand new, speedy stuff. And make sure you're updating your policies across agencies and teams. Make sure that when you are buying technology that it's accessible. And then also when you're developing and creating outputs, make sure those are accessible. Make sure the PDFs and the Word documents and any other documents that you generate are also accessible. So if you're making PDFs, open them up in Adobe Acrobat Pro and run an accessibility check and deal with any of the issues that are in there. And yes, it's hard to learn how to do initially, but once you figure it out, it just takes a little bit of doing. And feel free to ping me and I'll do my, maybe I don't want to say that, but maybe. And then if you're doing Word documents or Microsoft PowerPoint, there is a tab in the application that says review, and you click the review tab and then go to accessibility check, you click the button, and then a pane will come up and let you know what you need to correct. And then measure, and monitor, and make sure you're always improving and address anything that, you know, to try to make sure you're always compliant and reducing the number of issues you have. Now our case studies, and I'm going to let Kendra start talking a bit much.
Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit about, just some of these examples of the things that we're talking about happening in real life, right? Because it's nice to talk about it in theory, but we'll go a little bit into some of the things that we've done. And then from there, we'll talk a little bit more in the detail of how all of you can bake these things into your processes. So for starters, I mentioned that I spent a lot of time working for the state of Georgia. And so this is many years ago now, we launched a web platform that was serving about 80 or more sites. And that was built to Section 508 standards. This was before WCAG 2.0 was part of Section 508 standards. So we were compliant, right? Like, good job for us. We had, had made sure that that was part of our requirements when we built. But what we learned later on was that, well, that didn't mean that we were necessarily accessible, right? As we just talked about, like, compliant doesn't mean, like, that's checking a box. It doesn't always mean that people are actually able to access everything. And so our team went on a holistic accessibility initiative to improve all of our sites on the platform up to WCAG 2.0 standards. So we started with an accessibility audit with experts to identify the biggest issues, triage, prioritize, go through and make all of those updates. Our team learned as we did that work, and then we took training so that we could learn more on how to maintain things. And some of the other lessons learned there was just about having accessible frameworks, having design systems, like a platform that's scaled out across all of these different websites, made it a lot easier for us to meet this accessibility guideline for ourselves across 80 sites fairly quickly, right? Because we didn't have to do each one at a time. But that included our designs, so color contrast, fonts, and so on, development, fixing content on the sites, and then that training. And you'll hear me talk a lot about training because I think that's the most important component of all of this. Something that happened though at the beginning, before we got going, a story that I think is important to share is that I was in a leadership meeting with my director, and he was telling someone from like our agency's leadership that he wanted to do this accessibility initiative, and his leadership actually laughed at him, just straight out laughed about it, and was like, "Yep, no, we're not going to budget for that." And that was really a hard thing for me to hear and see. I was pretty upset, but the way that I, was like, oh, they said no, now we get to go grumble about the fact that they're not going to let us do the good things that we know are important. But Nikhil didn't take it that way. He said, okay, and he went and found money somewhere else. And he got a different agency within the state that funded ADA work to fund us so that we did it, and we just went rogue and did it anyways. And I tell this story because I think there becomes, people hear, hey, we did all these accessibility things, and you might think like, well, yeah, your leadership supported you. It only works if leadership supports you. And I'm an advocate for, we can do a lot of things without leadership supporting us, right? Like, we can learn how to make accessible things, and then you just do it. You don't have to ask permission to do it. You just do it. In this case, it was, going around to find like where the pockets of money were that we could make it happen. But I will say that taught me a lot about what it means to, prioritize and figure out the right, like how to do the right things, whether or not, someone at executive leadership likes the idea or not. Side note, that person was first in line for his photo op when we were recognized with a national award for our work. That's how these things work. A couple of other lessons learned for us then. Once we had done this, we're like, awesome, yay, now everything's WCAG 2.0 compliant. Now what? right? Like the next thing that we launch, if we don't consider all of this, we're going to be starting all over again, trying to remediate. So the lessons that we learn and baked into just everything that that Digital Services Georgia does now are accessibility starts at procurement. So we updated our procurement guidelines to require that we hire vendors that can demonstrate accessibility experience, that we bake in accessibility audits during procurement. And I think that's something that, in our world, it applies to the government work, but I think that there's ways that that can apply to commercial spaces too. We also, really found value in using an accessible framework. So we use Drupal 8, which starts accessible, as its base, so that building on, we're not trying to remediate a lot of things that are already baked in. And then using an accessible design system gets us started with all the new pieces. Like there's still going to be work to do, but it gets you, a couple levels up. And then we also, because at this point we had more support to be more proactive about these things, our team was able to update Georgia's design standards to require WCAG 2.0. This was before the Section 508 standards were updated to require it. We just were able to get buy-in by then to require it for all Georgia websites. So, the whole life cycle, like let's make sure we're baking this in as we go.
And you reminded me of something that I should have mentioned earlier. If you have leadership that says no, look at their leadership and figure out if there's a way you can cultivate a relationship with their leadership to get them to prioritize accessibility and beyond compliance, which is what I did on one of my last projects. And now they are mandating accessibility first as their strategic direction and their unique value add, which is great. Just sometimes you gotta be really, this is where the creativity really comes in. It's not necessary, especially with using design patterns, we're just like plug and play so much, but it's how do you use your knowledge for good or evil if you want. I don't know, just stay away from me if it's evil.
But that's a really good point, just finding your allies in general, right?
Definitely. Oh, we are on a new screen. Haha. It's a long day.
Tag, you're it.
So I worked on a project with FEMA back in 2017, and they had a redesign of floodsmart.gov. The previous website had been hacked, and all the content was put in what I like to think of as drawers. Those accordions. So there were just stacks of accordions on FEMA.gov full of this flood insurance content. And basically users were arriving, taking a minute, and then bouncing because it was just way too hard to find anything, way too difficult to use. And it also was not accessible because you couldn't find out what was in the accordions. Whenever an accordion is closed or a drop down is closed, that content that's inside isn't accessible to screen readers or even search engines. So it's not great for SEO that way. One big thing that we learned with doing floodsmart.gov was make sure that you involve your audience and your stakeholders in your process from beginning to end. We were on this weird schedule. So the task order set, the overall project was user-centered solution, but we weren't allowed to talk to users for many, many task orders down the pipeline. So what we had to deliver before that was a taxonomy that the website would be built on, the whole information architecture, what the navigation would be, what the headings would be, what pages we'll have. How are we supposed to create a user-centered one if we don't talk to users? So I chose to say, well, it's supposed to be user-centered. So I am going to go out on a limb and say I get to talk to users. We just can't organize recruiting. So we'll get creative about it. And we used, I was at GMMB at the time, and there was a big staff. So we used the staff and we used the staff's social media networks, and we sought people who would need to know about flood insurance. I fortunately, have friends that have been through a lot of hurricanes, Bestie in New Orleans and other places, and so leveraged everyone's social media networks to co-create that taxonomy using card sorts and tree jack studies to make sure that we were using their mental models. We broke down the language to fifth grade reading level as best we could, at least with the structure. And then also big piece was using storytelling to get our leadership to understand. So when we started the project, the C-level folks thought that they were creating a marketing site for flood insurance. Once I got working on it, I helped them understand the use case for this is actually people are looking for information. And so it's an information site where people really just want to get in, go to the information, get the information, and get out of there. And so my proudest moment was when the director said, so this page looks a little boring, but you know, when I think about what it needs to do, the information's really easy. It's right there. This is better. We don't need those big pictures after all. So he was perfectly fine with that quote unquote boring. It's not really boring, but it's not a Nike page. It doesn't have to be.
That is such a win, Jennifer. Did he acknowledge that boring is what's called for in this particular instance where we're looking at flood insurance and not buying shoes?
Yeah, Butch Kearney is the bomb. He's awesome.
Awesome.
He and Claudia were both great to work with. Big piece there was also that we used the US web design system. We copied the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript from that and used that to make our wireframes and our testable design prototypes rather than using Sketch and Envision. The first US web design system was really great because it was relatively primitive. Like it was just the HTML, CSS, JavaScript. It wasn't the tokens and the layers of things you need to configure, which it is, as I understand, the last time I looked at it now. But that meant that we could take these prototypes, design them responsively, and help understand what it would work like, and also test it, evaluate how much weight that image adds, how much we save by going to an SVG at mobile. It also helped me coach the team. They were an ad agency that was primarily they had won awards for Obama's campaign. They did Hillary's campaign. They primarily did a lot of advertising, some WordPress sites for political folks. Doing government work was one of their new endeavors. And they also did work for some nonprofits, but meeting Section 508 was somewhat new to them. And responsive web design was really new to this team. So being able to pair program with the designer and work with her side by side and teach her these things. That way I was able to help the team understand what responsive meant, but also what accessibility meant and how Section 508, just like Kendra is saying all the time, that's only the minimum. Let's go above and beyond and make sure it's truly accessible and inclusive. Then that test-driven design and development, by creating these in the designs in code and running them in the browser, we're able to run tests with web page tests, Lighthouse, Axe, whatever tools we want to use to evaluate what our key UX performance indicators will be, and then be able to give those to development and say, as the site goes into development, it needs to be, needs to load in less than 2 seconds on a slow 3G connection, for example.
As if your city is flooded, your internet might not be moving very quickly.
Well, you'd have the flood insurance beforehand because you need, like, I forget, it's been a while since, well, another wonderful thing that happened as we were working on this was Stephen Colbert did a segment on how messed up the whole National Flood Insurance Program is. That was really good for morale. Yeah, look that up. I don't want to. That's rough. But at least we made a great website.
I really do. I'm so interested in how many people pull up these sites when they're flooded, though. Like, oh, shoot, for next time, I should probably do this.
Yeah, well, in the first 3 months that this launched, we had 1.5 million unique visitors.
Wow.
And the bounce rate had dropped like massively compared to before. And people spent very little time on the home page, but went on to another internal page. So we did what we set out to do.
Yeah, that's awesome.
At Akamai, I joined to make a new performance analytics proof of concept. And what was great there was we were going rogue. So the product owner wanted to have a UX designer. The internal house UX team had a backlog of like 2 years. So he wouldn't have been able to get anything done for 2 years, and he needed to like take something to clients like right away. And the in-house UX process used Axure for prototyping and Angular for front-end development. We went completely rogue and we used free online tools for collaborative wireframing, because we were all in time zones all around the world. And we also used, once again, the semantic responsive HTML, CSS, JavaScript prototypes. We had a schedule to go on site to big clients, but in the interim, we needed to create something that was user-centered. And so we sought through the company similar users and involved them as we did all of this. We set requirements based on those findings and the industry market analysis we did. And we prioritized accessibility and web performance as business requirements from the start. We were even aiming for AAA as much as we possibly could, with the understanding that we might have to pivot, but we were aiming for the best. And once again, using the same thing, the test-driven design and development. And so because we were using this, we were able to have design turnarounds 95% less time than the regular UX team did, because our process was so lightweight, which gave us the opportunity to do more iterations with users. So you may have guessed that I'm a huge proponent of what's now called design technologists and UX engineers. Having them on teams is, I believe, very invaluable.
That's amazing. I think I don't know if anyone else is noticing, but all of our stories are about going rogue and getting creative.
I hadn't thought
Figuring out how to do it anyways.
My old manager calls me a force, and I do, what was that? There was some TV show I watched recently, something that was big, and they had a sweater and it said rebel, 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 rebel all in it. And I'm like, I want that sweater because I'm such a rebel.
Yes, own it.
So at Fidelity, I was actually brought in because the director of this innovation team and I had worked together at an insurance company a couple of years before. He'd watched my career. I had worked for Aaron Gustafson, creating this showcase Chrome web app, responsive using HTML5 and CSS3, which were at that time in 2011 cutting edge. And we made this special web app of the WikiHow survival kit. And then I went to work also at a startup, and we were doing a lot of cutting edge exploration on HTML emails and responsive websites. So he asked me if I would join this innovation team that was working on the responsive redesign of fidelity.com, and uniquely the accounts and trade experience. So I came in and they'd been stuck on what you see here in this screen for a year. They were trying to figure out, how do you take the positions grid, which is at that time 13 columns and could be thousands of rows of data, and present that in a responsive way. And I came in, I had an idea on my first day, like it was wacky. I was like, oh, so you're using all this JavaScript. You don't need to use JavaScript. You can just do this with HTML and CSS and it's really fluid. So after the meeting, I asked if I could borrow his old laptop because mine still wasn't in yet because corporate takes a while sometimes, you know. And I took 20 minutes, made this thing with Notepad and showed it to him when he got back from his meeting. And he said, this is why I brought you in. So that got set aside for a while. We wound up trying to build the JavaScript one. Once again, it kept hanging, redraw, stock breaking layout. And we wound up, the VP said, use Jennifer's idea. And then we did that. We brought it into the lab, in the usability lab. We brought customers in and we would iterate on the design based on what our customers told us. And once again, this is the big thing, is co-create with your users. And as much as possible, co-create with users with disabilities. Those edge cases, those extreme users that teams like to dismiss, that's where I call it, that's where the butter is. That's where the gold is. And if you are aiming for them, then you're going to make it better for everyone. And you'll also reduce your friction. So having that prototyper available to create responsive semantic HTML, CSS prototypes, and then use realistic mock data. In this case, we had to use mock data, obviously, because it's finance. Sorry, I see the questions and we'll do them at the end. So make sure you, we'll go back through the thing. And then you're also able, one of the other things that gives you that I've found helpful for my teams is if you have the semantic, responsive, accessible prototypes, now you also have the code that you can give to development and they have what they need to properly build the site, to build the output. And always make sure stakeholders understand users' needs.
Oh my goodness, yes, that's storytelling. I think as I'm thinking about, our audience today is primarily UX folks. I keep focusing on this third bullet here, thinking if anyone is looking for like, how do they want to level up to create, like more value in their jobs. Finding prototypers who can do responsive semantic HTML and CSS is not easy at all. And I feel like that's definitely a spot that that we need more of and can really help, like looking to encourage people to develop those skills too.
Yeah, but I think, but I also want to say, like, follow your, as a UXer, follow your, what do you call it, piper. Find what lights your fire.
Right.
If your fire is research, if your fire is content, strategy, whatever, follow that. I am a weirdo, I'm a Stitch. And I used to be full stack. So for me, I love the Tinkerbell CSS magic. I love that stuff. I come from book production, so I'm used to page templates and style sheets. So my brain just thinks that way, but that's not necessarily for everybody. And so, but I still believe that teams benefit from having a real prototype of this type, not just Acture and Sketch and Envision, those hotspots that don't replicate what it's really going to be like. I'm working on something with the US digital response folks right now, and the output is going to be Google site. So I'm doing the prototyping in a Google site because that's what makes the most sense. It's the closest to the end output. So we're better able to evaluate and catch the hiccups before we go to launch date.
Nice.
And how do you want to get started?
Yeah. And I'm checking the time here. We always get too excited about our case studies and just want to talk about those forever. But here's some more on like, taking those and some tips on how to, do those things. So the takeaways that I think we want to cover today are things like, prioritizing accessibility as a business requirement, defining, measuring, monitoring key metrics, co-creating with a diverse audience. So these are the things that you've been hearing us talk about in the case studies. Jennifer, did you want to talk about any of them in specific now before we jump to the next, to diving
Sure.
into details?
I'll just read the last couple, which is make sure your entire team has empathy for your users, whether that's the stakeholders or the people. Well, that's always, anyway, whether it's your team or whether it's your client, make sure everybody understands your user, your range of users. Always aim for the highest quality standards. So steward industry best practices and teach your teams, teach your clients. Then create an accessibility and inclusive design culture. So what can you do to level up your teams? What can you do to level up your company to care more about accessibility and like accessibility beyond compliance? And what does that actually mean to them? Do they even understand what compliance is? And what do you have to do to help them understand what compliance is without making them feel like they just had their nose rubbed in poop, you know? I'm living with my sister's cat, you know?
I love it. All right, so this is my favorite slide here, so bear with me. Because when we talk about baking in accessibility throughout the whole life cycle, I like to think about, you know, what does it mean if you're not baking accessibility in? So if you don't have an accessibility process and you're procuring or you're hiring a team to build something, or you're hiring people, it's not going to cost you anything because you're not even thinking about it, right? Easy peasy. Same with doing any discovery work. If there's no accessibility process, it's going to be low cost. As you get into design, maybe you're going to take a little bit of time to think about color contrast, but if you're not, again, it's going to be very low cost. But now as you start getting into development, you're going to find that people start building things and they're building off of these designs that were based on this discovery, that all of it has no accessibility, it's not informed by this thought process. And so your cost of trying to remediate or deal with things goes up a lot higher as you get here. If you don't get to it until you're doing testing, this is when we're in big trouble, right? Because now test things, we have this huge list of backlog of things to fix. Now you've got to figure out which ones you're going to deploy with and which ones you're going to take the extra cycles to remediate before you launch. And then which ones you're going to deal with after deployment. And again, you end up with the backlog that never ends, and it becomes this unending cycle, right? Of we didn't think about it before, now we're being sued, and so we have to go fix it. And so, the cost and the effort just becomes a little extra.
Well, and the other thing is if you launch with accessibility issues, then you are excluding folks. So there's more cost, and like you don't have, like if it's a revenue-based thing, there's less revenue. If it's a service, then there's less people who are actually able to get the life-saving services that they need. And so then you wind up with, I can get really hyperbolic and catastrophize here, but the reality is that there are people that are in those catastrophic situations too.
For sure. Yeah. So when we're looking at costs, it can be time, effort, capital, or just lost revenues, how people are impacted. So now I like to go back to what if we do put accessibility checkpoints and training in from the beginning? It's going to take us more time, more cost at the beginning during that procurement phase, because we do have to think about what requirements, and settings we're going to put in there, what we're asking for, and how we're making sure that that meets accessibility. Also, probably the initial cost will be higher because, they're baking all of that in. So instead of paying for it here at the end. Same with discovery. So if we're reviewing call center logs for signs of cognitive and usability issues, if we're including user types or personas that include stress cases, and how are people processing this when they're on month 11 of a pandemic and their child is tugging at their leg all the time, right? Like if we're building these, if we're building these things in, there's going to be a bit more time spent at the beginning. And then when we get to design, there is going to be some time and effort spent on remediating and including, checking for color contrast, checking font sizes and image choices, making sure we put in alt text. Like these things all take some time. Measuring our touch targets for mobile, right? On and on. But overall, if we've thought about it in the design process, then that cost, that time and effort in the development process is not going to be nearly as high because it's already baked in. There's no questions about, oh, which color, how do I do this? It's already there. And so this is the best part, right? If we've thought about it through the design and development, when you run test scripts or have an auditor come in and do testing, you're not going to find this huge backlog of remediation issues. And so now we get to some deployment where it's party time. We get to start thinking about what are the enhancements we're going to make next, instead of like, oh shoot, now how are we going to work down this backlog? So there we go. I think this is my last one for a little bit. So we talk about just like the ways that we can define and measure. Jennifer, I think this one's yours. I think we've changed the schedule.
You can do anything. If you want to talk about it, you can talk about it. Like the biggest thing that, so our unusual approach, in case you hadn't noticed, is to take this and make it a little more conversational. So basically, like I'm a big metrics, I'm a big test-driven, data-driven person. And so I always say, like, define what your budgets are. Like, set how long the page should load, set what accessibility means to you on your project, and set it down so everybody like that of folks, so everyone knows what's expected, and then measure it and monitor. Oh, looks like my internet connection is unstable. Please behave. And then keep monitoring. And so there are ways to measure these things through call center volume, time on site, web performance metrics, accessibility compliance. There are tools you can use like web page test, the browser extension from DQ. Google Analytics will tell you a lot if you've got that or some other comparable tool. And the main goal is basically just make sure no one's excluded. And the more people aren't excluded, the more people you have engaging, and then you have happier business. And I really am a big fan of having the humility to know that I don't have all of the answers. And the best way to make sure that I'm meeting my users' needs is to co-create with them and make sure it's as diverse a range of people as possible. Bring people with disabilities in, bring people from historically marginalized communities in, and make sure that everyone's able to use it. Understand what their mental models are, make that taxonomy, make sure the plain language meets everyone's needs. As best as possible, figure out how do you provide an equitable design? How do you meet the needs of everyone instead of just the status quo? And then make sure you're prepared to iterate based on that feedback. And then make sure everybody cares. Everybody has the empathy. I refer to it as I have that experience of those users in my bone marrow. I will never forget this one wife that I spoke to. I will never forget her. And it's in my body. And I'm going to make sure that I advocate for her and train the team, give them that same experience. So when they're, I don't know, making that mock-up or writing that code, they know who they're doing it for and they care. And when senior leadership especially knows that they're building it for that oil rig worker's just worked a really long shift, but knows he needs to renew his flood insurance for his house back in Huma in the swampy areas of Louisiana, he's thinking about him when he's making those decisions about the project. And then industry best practices. So sometimes if you're early career, I guess it can be really hard to know exactly what industry best practices are, but it's possible. Like, and you can always reach out to others in the industry and find out, do some research. For me, web standards is a big one. web content accessibility guidelines. There's tons of information. There's an author, Tammy Everts, Everts, and she is with a company called Speed Curve. And her writing on web performance it's the best. And just make sure you stay up to date and then steward that information through your teams.
I think as I'm thinking about what that education means, and we're going to post some resources at the end, but for starters, it can mean just like running a, online tool that can start calling out recommendations. But if you do have the resources, following that up with doing an audit with an accessibility expert can be a great way not only to identify priority issues, but really to learn how to do it yourself next time. I think just generally thinking about those sorts of experiences as not meaning that anyone's done anything wrong, right? But like, this is how we can learn, and like, tell me more. How do we get this right the next time around? Can be really powerful and really helpful.
Yeah, if anyone's working on fitness goals or diet goals, aren't we always trying to do better? Same thing should happen to our work.
Sure.
It's a wise idea if what you're making is going to be a responsive website, to use responsive design patterns and get that prototyper in that I talked about before. Use semantic markup and web standards from the beginning, and then something called progressive enhancement, which some folks think is really old, but it's actually still the industry best practice. Progressive enhancement means start with the simplest experience first and then enhance on. So we tend to build a lot of React and Angular apps these days, and I've seen them implemented so nothing renders unless JavaScript is enabled and the JavaScript runs. But if you put that on a slow 3G connection, there's a page I'm thinking of that's really critical, that you don't get any of the useful information. You don't get the logo, you don't get the contact information for 30 seconds. I feel like I should be able to hand a citation out to that product. Because there's no indication that you're not hitting one of those spoof sites, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And performance budgets and progressive enhancement go a long way to delivering an optimal user experience. And then make sure you scale those best practices through frameworks, design systems, platforms, and consistency. For those of us with cognitive impairments, man, if it's consistent, I won't be in a bad mood. I won't be tired. I won't be irritated because I was struck by surprise and I can't find something. So.
Yeah, so then I think we've talked about these things already, right? So semantic HTML and CSS and JavaScript with responsive wireframes whenever possible. And then using test-driven design and development. So measure and monitor things as you go to make sure that you're continuing to improve on and update things so that they're more accessible.
Hire a prototyper who can code to validate your designs before you actually send them over to development.
Become the prototyper you can code.
Yeah, you don't have to worry about React to do this stuff, to be honest. You don't have to learn React and Angular. You can just focus on HTML, CSS. You don't even really have to learn JavaScript. You can just focus on HTML and CSS and you can be a great prototyper. And then you can have the developer pump in the little bits of JavaScript if you need it, or then you can tackle vanilla JS and do it yourself. I know just a little bit of vanilla JS. But prioritize the semantic HTML. It is so vital. And then in development, you want to also make sure you're commenting your code so that those who maintain it will understand what the intentions were. And it's also about good code hygiene. So hopefully you can hire developers who are blind. Wouldn't it be great? Like, it's a great opportunity. And when you're using invalid data like test data, make it really obvious that it's not. Make it deliberately bad and use these weird things. Like this wonderful guy from the BBC, Jamie Knight, he has this good tip. And he says, when he's using test data, he uses Disney villains, and you know if Scar shows up, it because he's up to no good.
I love that. Okay, I think when we share out the slides, this can be a really helpful one then to reference for accessibility checkpoints. So we talked about, these different pieces for product, for discovery and design. My team right now is working on improving our definitions of done so that we know, as we go for every checkpoint, how we're going to make sure that we're building things that are accessible. So I feel like this is a good one that, pick the thing that you're not sure about and Google it. And then it can get you to, what might that mean, or how might you, recommend to a team that, or ask, are we doing end-to-end testing with axe checks, or, depending on your role and where you are.
I feel guilty that when I changed this design, I made it white light text on a dark background, because now if you wanted to print this out, it's not so great. So I recommend taking this, inverting it, bump up the contrast before you print.
Good thinking.
I figured dark slides for the end of the day because everyone's been staring at screens. So
you think of everything, Jennifer.
It's anxiety.
All right.
There you
Key
go.
takeaways. No, Stitch.
He's writing them down too.
He is. I think I'm going to go back to the training. So that can be, Google the things, look through resources, run X things on your browser, and then figure out how to troubleshoot things. Talk to your team about what definition of done would be, right? Like I know I'm the broken record, but it's okay not to know. Nobody knows.
Yes. Yes. If you're doing
10
agile,
years and still nobody knows.
if you're doing agile, I don't know is a valid response. And anybody who gives you crap because you don't know isn't doing agile right. Humility and resilience are the two best qualities of a user experience designer.
True that. All right. So encourage your friends and coworkers to learn. Look up resources. Just generally, thinking about the strategies and how you can, what sorts of questions can you ask to find more opportunities to improve on things. And I think we've covered this one a few times too, that idea of storytelling. So getting your data to drive decisions, but also just like, where can you find that example of someone that you talk to that, is going to be greatly impacted by these changes. Did you want to add anything on this one, Jennifer?
No, I'm good. And accessibility and security are everyone's responsibility. And these are the resources. Just a heads up, that uxui.org one, I just put them up there, so it's not the most beautifully designed thing. Forgive me. It's a lot of information though. Bad for cognitive overload.
Yeah, so we had, these couple of .dev ones are the official resources. This one here, the uxui.org, is the list that, Jennifer and I put together, mostly Jennifer, of all the resources that could be helpful. So it's a very long list, but has all sorts of goodies on there. So
I forgot to remind you to click the checkbox.
Did it not work?
I don't know.
Only I can hear it?
Shoot. I put a Rickroll secret thing in here, and it's playing.
I can hear it.
So I was hoping to wake everyone up and make people feel casual and comfortable.
Oh, I thought I had it fixed. No. Thank you all for just, giving us your time, letting us chat you up for a little while. You can add us on Twitter, and any questions?
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Jeff. You two, I laughed, I cried, I got rickrolled. So I will play the role of the gatekeeper moderator for the next few minutes, if you're willing to entertain questions from a very inquisitive crowd.
Absolutely.
Quick reactions from me before we dive into questions. I think, like, oh my gosh, so many good little nuggets along the way. Everything from stress cases to design technologists. I was furiously scribbling notes on Post-its throughout. But I think the big takeaway from me, and I'm looking over at my notepad, um, a lot of what you guys talked about really struck me that it's taking what we know and what we're good at as user experience professionals, whether product people or designers or whatever, right? Because we're all in the user
Mhm.
experience game, and really leveling that up, right? Like, we know that we should prize empathy above ego. We know that we should prize, scrappiness over settling, but taking that lens and applying it to all of our users and pushing that much harder and saying, no, look who's on the board. Are we writing off that person because they're under stress
Mhm.
and they're coming into our website experience 11 months into a pandemic, and gee, their uncertainty and anxiety might be a little high walking in the door, right? And once you start to think about that, then you step into that next level of, okay, what about somebody who lives like that permanently, right? And just unpacking that, I think you've really laid out a really nice case for where and how we can take what we're already doing and do it that much better. So thank you.
Thank you.
You.
So questions. We'll kick off with one from Jimmy, and I love this part because I get to butcher everybody's name. So Asha gave me an easy one, Jimmy. I think I can get that right. Jimmy asks, do you, and I think this is for both of you, do you have an outline of all of the techniques you used, e.g. storytelling, techniques for obtaining information when you can't talk to users, etc.? So that's kind of that question of, I can't actually go talk to humans for fill in the blank reason. How do I scrappy around that?
I remember this designer I worked with, and he said that he didn't want to make the site accessible because accessibility is ugly. That he was an artist and he wanted to use pale pink and white and gray and mint. And I just said, I wanted to say something snarky. I wanted to say, oh, so you're not up to the challenge of delivering design that meets everybody and meets this challenge. But instead I said, Ohana, no one gets left behind or forgotten. And I just walked away because I knew I needed to just not say anything more. And I basically, it's all about, like, how much creativity do you have in your brain? Stretch the possibilities. Like, if you were stuck and you needed to get out of some trap, that's sort of where you're at. Figure out how to apply your creativity to solve a problem. And just make sure you don't break any laws.
Yeah, I don't think I have an outline. I think it's, that similar, just thinking of, what are the ways that we can get, around this issue. I know a lot of people will just pull their friends and family, when they need users to talk to,
Yeah,
in a pinch.
that one's a tricky one because, to be honest, most of us who are working in tech are people who have privilege and power. And so one of the things I think about is, how do I reach the people who couldn't possibly be in this room? How do I involve them? And that one is really, really hard, because the people I think of who are the most unlikely are the people who don't have devices and don't have internet access.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm always trying to get us to think about, well, when we're thinking about the solution, are we also thinking about physical solutions and ways? Are we thinking about people who only access the internet at community centers and libraries or Best Buy? Because I know there are times in my life where I didn't have devices, and so I would go to the Apple Store and Best Buy and use their computers. And just always be thinking about those in the greatest need and doing the greatest good for those in greatest need.
That's awesome. Thank you. So now a name I get to screw up. Yay. So this one is from Natalie. It's either Wagner or Wagoner. One of those I'm screwing it up, and I'm just delighted by that. She asks, could you talk more about your, and this is related to the last question, I think, in a lot of ways. Could you talk more about your recruiting strategy for conducting studies inside of organizations? Did you specify who you were looking to work with?
That depends. So that depends. In some cases, I knew that I wanted to find specifically people with disabilities and people from historically marginalized communities. And I knew, for example, that our current recruiting process excluded those people, not intentionally, but definitely did. And so I went rogue because that's what I do. And we sought those folks where we could, and we just prioritized people who were willing to identify that they had a disability, and we prioritized historically marginalized people. There's also this, happens to be right here, this book, and it's reversed because I don't flip the thing. It disorients me terribly, but this book, Design Justice, there's some frameworks in here that there's a table, and when you recruit participants, you list out your demographics in this table, and you show who you spoke to, and you show the gaps in who you didn't speak to, and then that gives you risk analysis. And then it also identifies opportunities for future research. And if you're looking for that and can't find that, hit me up, or I also can recommend perusing the GitHub repo of the teams that Kendra works with. Sneaky way of saying it.
You could probably share that link, right? If it's public, it's public for a reason. So
yeah, the last one I worked on isn't public, but I think some of my colleagues may have variations that are public. So yeah, as far as recruiting, there are also some organizations like Fable that specialize in doing user research with people with disabilities. And then there are, in a pre-COVID time, Ginny Reddish, who is a really very, very incredible user experience content strategist person, and Whitney Quesenberry, who leads the Center for Civic Design. I met with both of them to look for ideas of how to recruit people with disabilities, and going to local assisted living facilities, going to other community centers, and renting a room at the library, renting a room at the facility. So you're giving some money back to the organization and going to them rather than having anyone come to you. I'm going to say people with disabilities and people who have socioeconomic challenges, traveling to you is going to incur a burden, not just financially, but energy and cognitive wise. So always be thinking about the impact of your actions on the others.
It's a really good point. I think, yeah, you know more about the recruiting than I do. I don't have to recruit.
So this is a good one. It's a three-parter. We'll start kind of piece by piece. This is from Ben Megzaman. I'm sure I screwed that up. I'm sorry, Ben. His first, and we'll kind of unpack these because they're all related, but I think they're kind of good broad thematic questions. So his first question is, how do you determine which disabilities to address, knowing that there's a large spectrum within a single disability and that no one individual can represent anyone?
Beautiful, Ben. That's absolutely true. Mostly it's what do I have access to? That's the big piece. Yeah. We had this survey that pretty much excluded anyone who had any kind of cognitive challenges of any sort. So we were lucky to get anybody with disabilities through this particular recruiting form. Fable Fable specializes in it, so I imagine their recruiting may be better and broader. We do accessibility auditing for meeting WCAG 2.0, which WCAG 2.0 has manual testing that's required in it as well. And then you have to do testing with screen readers and keyboard only, magnify your screen, test it on mobile devices, use those screen readers. And if you're doing generative research, my goal is generally to get as much of a range of users as possible. And I think one of the benefits of years of experience is just that you've seen a lot, learned a lot. Always ask out, always, like Kendra was talking about, reach out to experts, reach out to DQ, Level Access, Tenon, Nobility, the Pestiello group, and hire someone to come in and teach your team, and hire someone to do that work for you the first time and hold your hand through it. That's probably a wise bet. When talking about the results, make it clear to your team and stakeholders what you just said, Ben, which is that here's one person with PTSD. That's not the same experience that all people with PTSD have. It was a great point, Ben.
Yeah, I think this is one that I feel like I come up against that stumped me a few times. The example that I always think of is people that use screen readers will have different preferences for how much description they want to hear on the images, and whether or not an image makes sense for an image to have null alt text because their name is right next to it, so why do you need to put it there? And so those things, I think there's no right answer, right? This is where the process and the intent and the trying to get it right is better than doing nothing, because we're not always going to have a right answer, and one accessibility specialist will probably have a different recommendation than another one. But it is a journey, not a box to check. I've another instance where the recommendations that we were being given for how to make some read more links make sense for screen readers was going to make no sense for people that were viewing, like actually viewing the site. And so that's where I think that creativity and, where Jennifer was saying, like, are you not up for the challenge? Like, all right, let's acknowledge that these two things both are true. We want to make sure that people can use this for screen readers and without screen readers, and that it makes sense for both. So like, how can we get creative, and what are some ways to do this differently? But you're right, it's really hard. We're not always going to get it all right.
Just do the best you can and keep iterating and adding on as you learn. So all we can do, right?
Yeah, actually, so the third question in that trifecta ties to what you two were just talking about, and that is, have you ever had any disabilities that conflict when implementing a solution? And if so, how did you, like that point I think you were just making, Jennifer, about being creative. How can you share a specific example of sort of how you found the way through that needle?
I think Kendra was actually just talking about that, and I wanted to respond that, like, okay, so that adding additional text to the read more link to make it clearer for screen reader users, because sometimes they navigate the page by just tabbing through interactive elements, but it makes things longer for sighted users who maybe are fine with it just saying read more. But someone like me with a cognitive impairment actually needs you to be more explicit about what that read more is too. And it's also a WCAG issue, compliance issue, because links must make sense both in and out of context. And so adding something to make it clear what that link is and make it different from the other link that also says read more,
Yeah, I'm trying to remember now if we ended up falling back on ARIA labels. I think we got rid of the read more links altogether and made the titles the links instead.
That would work.
Yeah.
As long as it was styled and color wasn't the only indicator of interactive action. Nerd.
in a room full of them. So we're about a minute out from our 7:30 stop. Assuming Kendra and Jennifer are able to and interested in staying on longer, we can keep going with questions for another 10 minutes.
To help.
I'm good.
I see my old friend 4 there, and wow, that's hair. You definitely have pandemic hair.
What? So do I. Come on.
You ain't seen nothing.
Please pick it out. Pick it out big, big, big. Okay, I think a good question to wrap for those people that have to drop at 7:30, even though, and thank you too for staying on for a few minutes longer. But the big question that's the theme that seems to have come up, and I know it's one that people worry about, is about sort of going rogue, right? How do you walk that line? And the question this is in terms of your techniques and strategies that involved either of you going rogue. Did any of those rogue moves become the new standard? Such as the recruitment of disability and underrepresented users, for example. If so, any tips for those of us, and this is where it becomes the money question, right? Any tips for those of us trying to change orgs from the inside, which is a whole separate talk, but in a minute.
So I took a class, and I can't believe I'm going to plug this company, but I took a class from IDEO called Designing for Change. And that actually gave me the tips that I used at my most recent intense project. And so from when I started, when I was told that even meeting compliance was something we weren't going to prioritize, and to cut down the number of issues I document and things like that, I recognized that the people who were tasked with fixing the issues weren't going to prioritize it because their managers weren't going to prioritize it. So I recognized from my training and experience to go above and make sure that our client was going to be the one setting the standard and the expectation. And I started watching for people who showed the right enthusiasm that I thought I could get on board. And I set up one-on-ones with them weekly, and we would just shoot the breeze and talk about how are we going to bring more accessibility expertise across our teams. And then it just kept leveling up. And I built another relationship with another one of them. We started working on something together. And then what's really cool is for that person, the Black Lives Matter movement and everything that happened last early summer, late spring, popped something in their brain. They had a spark where they suddenly realized the importance of accessibility and inclusion. And they decided that this was going to matter too. And so that changed the whole strategic direction from the organization to one that is now accessibility first. And that means not just Section 508 compliance, but exceed it as best you can, which also is aligning with the White House with the 2.1. So always be looking for opportunities, I think is the big place. It can, I will say that being a change maker is a blessing and a curse. And as much as you can make progress, you're also probably going to make people uncomfortable and make some enemies. I have made lots of enemies, but I made enemies for the right reason. So tough, good riddance to those people. I will survive. I think it's my ringtone, actually. I don't remember. My phone hasn't rung properly in a while.
Love that.
Yeah, I think to add on, as I'm thinking about it, I'm surprised how many of the things that like my teams have sort of decided to do on their own just to test it out have ended up becoming the standard. And I look at it as, finding like where your influence is and where you can introduce like one new little change. Just think of it as, agile. So like, let's start here. And when you see success, we build on and then start sharing, like, hey, our team started doing this. It's been working really well. And other teams adopt it. And before you know it, that's how the whole, company is doing things. So I think at the state of Georgia, it was our strategy had to be different because the thing that leadership prioritized was recognition and awards. And so we had to play to that and figure out, how do we start getting recognition for this work so that they care about it. And that's actually worked really, really well. But that's not everybody's, thing. Turns out state of Georgia, or not state of Georgia, but all states, their leadership just cares about recognition. I don't think that's the same everywhere. Everyone has different motivations. In this case, on some teams, it's delivery speed. So if we can speak to, improving delivery speed, then, let's try tweaking this. Let's update our definitions of done, and then we can share it with everyone else. And Jennifer put together a whole bunch of great accessibility training on her last program that a lot of teams are using now. So
even across agencies, because my stakeholder, when we gave this talk in July, she shared the link to it in the chat, and I had agencies from all over the federal government and state governments emailing me to say, hey, thank you for this. My team's using this now, which was so cool.
That's awesome. We'll do one more.
Sure.
Awesome. Okay, we'll make this the last one. And thank you everybody for these questions. They were fantastic. So good. So last one, this is Ben's third, which is number 2 on his list. How do you get a deep understanding? This is like the perfect walk-off question. How do you get a deep understanding of any disability and overcome ignorance of a disability as a UX or product person, et cetera?
Hire them. Hire people with disabilities. Hire them. Change whatever it is about your workplace that you need to change, and hire people with disabilities. And I happen to be a Trojan horse. Like, look at me. I probably look like a white person, right? But I'm not. I'm Native Mexican, Black, and white. So you suddenly get like a person of color, but you thought you hired a white person. I seem perfectly abled, yet I'm not. And once you start pushing me on the time, you're going to discover my PTSD and my traumatic brain injury. Plus, I'm a huge advocate with lots of friends who have a whole range of disabilities. So hire them. Go to unconferences with people with disabilities. That was that was huge. I went to an unconference in Boston, and this was obviously pre-COVID. And people with disabilities are so generous, and they taught me how you help a person who is blind to navigate a space. They showed me how they use their Braille refresher device. Deaf people talked with me about at Fidelity, they prioritize hiring people with disabilities. And I had a colleague who was deaf who talked with me a lot about how he needed to use different Bluetooth earbuds and what processes and tools work for him. There was another colleague who had cerebral palsy, and I saw her assistive tech. I saw the things that she could and couldn't do. I understood her mental state and the incredible increased anxiety she had because she couldn't do as much work as her colleagues, and the fear of losing her job because she was afraid she'd be held to the same standards, and she just can't. But she brought so much more value for who she was and that unique experience that truly applied to the majority of the customers at the company too. So just hire them and go to unconferences, make friends with, here it is, make friends with people with disabilities, have alternative motives. Just, it can be really uncomfortable to go outside your sphere, but be curious, be infinitely curious about the human experience. And watch Crip Camp.
I have nothing more to add to that.
Thank you so much, both of you. And thanks to everybody who has, all 18 of you who stayed on past 7:30. We're keeping you from your Netflix time. I'm glad we were far more interesting than the Queen's Gambit. Seriously, a round of applause, Jennifer, Kendra. This was so good. I think you
My
have a
gosh.
room full of people who are more intrigued than ever about how to be better at representing all of us in better ways. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for giving us an
thank you.
opportunity to share this with y'all too.
Of course. Yay. For just quick admin, we have been recording this. So all of your mistakes are recorded. Teasing. So the recording will be live on our YouTube channel, which we will link to from Slack, Twitter, no, not Twitter, Slack, and probably the website. We'll figure it out. Anyway, it'll be linked from many places on the internet, which is not a fad, in probably about a week once we've got a chance to process through it all. And stay tuned for more events this spring. And again, reminder for those of you who have not signed up for the UXPA DC mentoring program, do it as a mentor or mentee or both. Jennifer, you've mentored, right?
Yes, I mentor through both AIGA, Shine DC, and UXPA. And if anyone on this call isn't mentoring, please mentor. Please, please, please. I happen to be this particular time hoping to get a mentor. But if we need more mentors as well, I'll happily mentor as well. But I think, I mean, anyone who's spent any time in this industry knows that they owe their career to the people who came before them, and we all have a responsibility to give back. I lost a couple of my mentors last year to COVID, Tom Tullis, Christopher Schmidt. Christopher actually didn't die of COVID. It was another person whose my brain is going right now, but I really want to be a multiplier like Tom Tullis was. He made so many hundreds, maybe thousands of him in our industry. And I'm going to see if I can. Maybe I can make a whole bunch more design technologists, UX engineer, prototypers, accessibility specialist people.
I love it. All right. Thank you so much. I'm so mad at COVID because I want to hug you both right now, but virtual hugs. Thanks again, everybody.
Chocolate works too.
Delivery's coming in the mail. All right, have a good night, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us.
Take good
Thank
care of
you.
yourselves. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Oh, and thanks also to Media Barn, Nikki.
Yes.
Yay,
Yay.
Media Barn.
I can't wait to go back to their
Give more
office.
virtual
It's
hug for
beautiful.
us. Bye, y'all.